Hey, co-reporters, welcome back to my channel. We've got a very special guest back on our channel, you guys, and his name is Dmitry Shaknovich from the YouTube channel D Shak Law. Dmitry, first of all, I really enjoyed filming the last collaboration we did together. That was really incredible, and I love the response that we got. So thank you again for coming back.
I appreciate you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So now this time we're going to get into the Michael Oher lawsuit. So Michael Oher is suing the Tuohy family. So if these names don't sound familiar to you, the story behind them will. There was a very popular movie that came out way back in the early 2000s called The Blind Side, starring Sandra Bullock. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe she actually even won an Oscar award for her performance in this film and everything, right? So the premise of the show was that there was this young guy who was struggling in life. His family had drug addiction problems, poverty problems, and whatnot. And he was just wandering around the streets. And this woman found him, brought her into her home with her rich family and everything. And she basically taught him how to play football, apparently, right? Etc. They basically saved his life. And now this man, Michael, is coming out saying that was not at all an accurate representation of his life or anything like that. He says, first of all, the movie presented me as illiterate, but I've been reading from very young. I was acting in plays in the second grade. That's not true. He's also speaking out against the film's kind of idea that you need to be rescued in order to succeed in life. He feels as though that is not the case. He's also saying that the Tuohy family is not the only family that contributed to his success. There have been other people who stepped up in his life to be there for him. So all of this is going to be found in his book that he just wrote. The book is entitled When Your Back is Against the Wall. I feel like this is very kind of compelling news because it opens up the conversation again about conservatorships and what might be seen as conservatorship abuse. Do you agree with that, Dmitry?
Sure. So ever since the Britney Spears thing happened, right, everybody knows what this is now. Prior to that, nobody did. Conservatorships are basically financial guardianships, right, where a court is supposed to monitor whether or not somebody can control their own finances. If the court decides that person can't for whatever reason, they appoint somebody to do that for them. That's really all this is. And the court monitors that process very closely, or at least should, and that's why it's so tough to win with the kind of allegations that Michael Oher is putting forth now.
So what do you mean by that? Are you saying that it kind of seems as though the family met all the conditions that should be in place in order to have a successful and what is the word, an ethical conservatorship on him?
Well, that's tough to say. What I can say is that a conservatorship was granted. What that means is that somebody at some point went into court and made an application before a judge, presumably supported by evidence, right? And that happened many years ago. And a judge made a finding, right? Issued a finding of fact that this conservatorship was appropriate. And so it's a closely monitored system in which oftentimes, and again, what happened here specifically is tough to say because I don't know. I wasn't there. But what happens oftentimes is that all parties are afforded lawyers and representatives, and the process is monitored very closely. It's not something that happens overnight, and it's not something that happens with ease.
So that makes it a little bit confusing because Michael's saying that he only found out a couple of months ago in February of this year that he was even under a conservatorship. He claimed that he thought that he had been adopted by this family this entire time, and that when he signed these conservatorship papers a couple months after turning 18, the family presented them as adoption papers. Is that something that seems likely to you?
Well, it's tough to say because I'd have to go into his head, and I can't do that. The family seems to say that he knew later or earlier rather than he's letting on about the conservatorship. Look, I suppose it's possible that somebody put papers in front of him that he signed, and that was that, right? Maybe he didn't read them closely. Maybe he didn't have good representation. All of those things are possible. But again, this is a court-monitored process.
And so how often, with it being court monitored, how often do people kind of convene to discuss whether or not a conservatorship is still appropriate for a given situation?
It really depends. It's really fact specific. But you do have, in all of these cases, you have many actors, right? You have the lawyers that represent the person that is pushing against the conservatorship. You have people representing the person that's pushing for it. You may have third parties there, obviously the court, right? So there is opportunity, generally speaking, in these processes for somebody to speak up, right? It's not supposed to be an adversarial process, at least not in the same way that a trial is supposed to be, at least not in the same way that, you defend a criminal case, for example, right? It's not you against the prosecutor, and the idea is all of the parties involved have to actually, obviously, act ethically and properly to get to the right result. And again, when a judge issues an order, presumably that's done on some evidence, and the standard for that order is met.
Okay. So guys, if you're just joining me, I am back again with Dmitry Sheknovich from D-Shack Law on YouTube. He covers a lot of very interesting legal news on his channel. So if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to his channel for more legal commentary. But for now, we're discussing the lawsuit between Michael Oher and the Tuohy family. And these people starred in a very, very popular and critically acclaimed film called The Blind Side. So now my question is, how would Michael be able to prove that he was tricked into this conservatorship? So for example, one of the things that he says is, take a look at the way the family has been promoting me when they've been making money off my name. They wrote books, they've got a family website and everything, and I'm listed in these books and in this family website as an adopted member of the family. And that kind of proves what I'm saying, which is that they claimed I was adopted, and I always believed that I was adopted, and it is just not true.
So look, this is really a game of it's a word game, right? Perhaps the word they would say, perhaps I'm purely speculating, right? They would say that the adoption what they meant by that is an illegal adoption. What they meant by that is they let him in as a member of their family, right? He was their son. That's how they felt about him. So you would really have to get into the evidence, right? If you're going to bring a case like this, a petition like this, you really have to get into the evidence of what each party knew and when. That's what makes these cases tough, right? Did Michael Oher, were the Tuohys and Michael Oher on the same page? If not, when, if ever, did they stop being on the same page? And when that happened, who was responsible, right? That's really the kind of three-step analysis that has to be conducted here.
Okay. And so now, I don't know too much about conservatorships, but the only things I know are from the Britney Spears case, okay? And so one thing I learned in the Britney Spears case was that a conservatorship can control your reproductive rights and your ability to get married or not. So Michael Oher has been married for a couple of years now. I remember seeing his wedding spread in People magazine. So is this something that he would have had to go to the conservatorship for in order to have permission to get married? He's got children. Is that another thing as well, or is it kind of conservatorship dependent?
So that's exactly right. Every state is different, right? And every process is different. There are different kinds of conservatorships. Some places call them guardianships, right? Depending on the required level of involvement of the conservatorship, it depends on what he would need their approval for. In some places here in New York, for example, they have a guardian for the personal, they have a guardian for the financial, right? It's different sometimes, and it's really, really fact dependent.
Okay. And so now when you kind of look at his situation, he seems to be of sound mind and everything like that. So what kind of reason do you think that the family can kind of push towards a judge for why this man would be under a conservatorship at this age? And also, even at the age of 18, why do you think they needed a conservatorship over him? Is that something that happens if you're unable to adopt someone, that you sometimes go for this route instead? Is that sort of normal?
Well, adoption is different than conservatorship. Those are two different things. And depending on where you are and the laws that apply, you may be eligible for one rather than the other, right? Adoption seeks to make the person being adopted a member of the family, right? Conservatorship is simply a process by which one is appointed a guardian of the finances of the other, right? It's very different. So it depends really on what they sought to have happen, right? And if and when they did seek a conservatorship, again, it would depend on why they were seeking it and what evidence was provided. If there was somebody appointed to represent Michael Oher, was that person in agreement? Was that person objecting, right? All of these things matter.
Yeah. I'm just having a really difficult time trying to understand how he would not know up until this age, because it's not like he's, 21, 22, 23. He's like in his 40s right now. So it's really crazy to me that he would not have known that, right? Or that it wouldn't have impacted his life, such as marriage, children, and spending money. For example, he says that the family is the one that reached out to production companies in order to get the film made. Apparently they made money from it, but he did not make any kind of money like that. I could see. But when it comes to spending his own money, did the family have a say over that? And he was not aware, what was happening here? Because it is kind of really difficult to get my mind around how this went on for so long without him realizing it before a couple of months ago.
So that depends on the terms of the conservatorship, right? When this conservatorship was granted, conservatorships aren't blanket pieces of paper, right? The devil's in the details. A conservatorship really depends on the terms, right? What has to be done and where, what he can do with or without their consent, right? And again, what's important is to identify who was representing each side, because if there was somebody appointed to represent Michael Oher, then that changes the game a bit, right? Because if he had counsel representation, that will deem his decisions informed, perhaps, and that's different.
Okay. And so, for example, if he did not have anyone representing him, would that give him a better shot at winning this lawsuit?
Presumably, right? Unless he claimed that he didn't think he needed one, right? Or something of that sort. And then there will be a question of whether or not he was informed as to that decision, right? So a judge will have to jump through some hoops to figure this one out. Assuming the analysis is to be conducted the way I'm presenting it, which it may not be depending on what the facts are.
Okay. So now the family has spoken out, and they're claiming, like you mentioned earlier, that Michael was aware of the conservatorship sooner than he is letting on to the public. And they've also said, listen, Michael, if you want to terminate this conservatorship, we can go ahead and terminate it, which would solve one part of the problem. But the other part of the problem is that Michael is claiming that he was not at all paid for this film that was made about him. Everybody else was paid, but not him. So how would the judge go about sort of figuring out that sort of the situation?
So again, you start with the terms of the conservatorship. You see what the Tuohys were obligated to do, right, as being the conservators here. And beyond that, right, it will eventually become a fraud case, right? That's really what this is, right? He's claimed that they lied to him to steal his money. And that's really the crux of the allegations. But you start from the conservatorship because that seems to be the governing legal mechanism in play here.
So a fraud case sounds like it could become criminal, right?
Fraud is one of those words that can mean a whole lot of things. It will depend here. In order for cases like this to become criminal, you really need a high standard to be met. And again, for a conservatorship, right, you need court involvement. You need court approval. So this isn't something that they just did on their own, right? Again, presumably, right, other parties were involved here that should have been impartial, that helped come to this determination.
Yeah. So how do you think this lawsuit is ultimately going to pan out, in your best sort of legal guess?
Well, most of these cases just end with a settlement, just because statistically speaking, that's how most cases end. So it may go that way, but it may also be thrown out early, depending on the terms, right? So all of these things are possibilities. You would really have to take a deep dive into the real evidence to know what really is going on.
Okay. Have you ever seen anything kind of like this play out? Maybe not on the scale of someone becoming rich and famous or athletic or whatever, but have you heard of cases like this where someone who's completely unrelated to a person becomes a conservatee and then ultimately claims that they were kind of, scammed into becoming a conservatee to somebody else?
Cases like this are rare. Typically, when these kinds of things happen, they happen within a family, right? They happen if you have a child perhaps that is incapacitated in some way, or an adult that is incapacitated or becomes incapacitated. So something like this is rare, right? The storyline of the movie being that he was a kid that came from poverty and they took him in. That happens very rarely.
Mm-hmm. So, oh, sorry to cut you off. What did you say? Sorry.
Well, I said it's possible, but it's unlikely that these things happen.
Mm-hmm. And so what kind of like standards have to be met to get a conservatorship over somebody? Because to me, it sounds a little bit wild that you can just find a random teenager, get conservatorship over them, and then, start kind of making business decisions for them and whatnot. Are there any barriers to this? I would hope.
Oh, yeah, there are a ton of barriers. And that's why I keep saying that presumably there was a court process that happened here, right? Mm-hmm. Look, a judge. Look, obviously, the idea is to protect the allegedly incapacitated person, as they call him, from being taken advantage of, right? That's the whole point, right? And that's just not in this case where Michael Oher turned out to be a famous football player, right? That's in all cases, right? You want to make sure that the person, the subject of this application, isn't somebody who is going to be taken advantage of. And there are numerous safeguards, hearings put in place to make sure that happens. It's a big deal, these decisions. They don't just happen overnight. And, oftentimes these decisions happen with incapacitated folks who have medical issues, end of life decisions, right? That's how these things happen all the time. And so these are complex questions. And, if you come to court, the way it should be is if you pull a stranger off the street, come into court and try to be his guardian in some way, that can be a little tough, particularly if somebody opposes it, and even if not, right? It's going to be an analysis that has to be undergone to make sure that everything is being done in the best interests of this allegedly incapacitated person.
So on the topic of incapacitated, so what would have qualified Michael as being incapacitated? So in the film, they claim that he was illiterate, unable to read and write. Do you think that the family kind of pushed that sort of narrative about him behind his back in some sort of way? And that's why he kind of fell into that category somehow?
Well, that I just don't know the answer to. But presumably, right, if you go and you try to convince a judge of something like this, you would have experts come in. You would have somebody come in to substantiate these allegations, right? Or at least that would be the right way to do it, to make sure that, again, the allegedly incapacitated person isn't being taken advantage of.
Mm-hmm. And so just last question here. What is the likelihood of corruption having, gone down in the courtroom to make this conservatorship happen? Because this was portrayed as a very affluent family within sort of like a small community or whatever. So do you think that there is some sort of possibility that there might have been corruption?
There's always a possibility. I haven't seen anything that would suggest that. I'm not intimately involved, obviously, in this case, or even close. Right. Mm-hmm. But I haven't seen anything to suggest that. Theoretically, these things are always possible. You would like to think that the court system is better than that. And as someone who works in that system, that's kind of the line that I'll draw.
Yeah, understandably. So now, you guys, if you're just joining, I am here with Dmitry Shakhnovich from D Shak Law. He's got a wonderful YouTube channel where he discusses all sorts of legal news from all sorts of different categories. It's not just pop culture. It's not just true crime. It could be politics as well. It's a lot. So make sure to head over to his channel if you haven't already. Now, Dmitry, I asked you earlier, in your expert legal opinion, how you think this is going to turn out. But now, what do you think really happened? Like, was there an agreement potentially that, to this conservatorship, and then somebody had a change of heart? Like, what do you think really happened when you kind of parse through all the information coming from both sides?
All we know now is that Michael Oher thinks he was defrauded. That's what we know now. Mm-hmm. When that belief developed, it's hard to say. I know he played in the NFL for a long time. You never know who and what impacted this decision. But it's important to run only with the facts here. The facts are that, at this point, he seems to think that he was wronged. And the details as to why he thinks that should be flushed out and presumably will in court.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I like that. Thank you. That's what I love about having Dimitri on the channel, is that he always keeps me focused on the facts. I'm always here, there, everywhere. He's like, no, facts, facts, facts. So thank you for that. You guys, it has been so awesome talking about this case with you. We're going to continue to follow it as it plays along, and I'll hopefully be able to get Dimitri back on this channel to discuss further if possible. So once again, he does have a YouTube channel. It's called D-Shack Law, where he provides all sorts of legal commentary. So make sure to go ahead, subscribe to his channel, okay? Thank you so much for watching. And Dimitri, thank you for joining me again. And I'll see you in my next. Of course. See you guys in the next video. Bye.